The muddy waters of Kenya's Mara River surged violently as David Thompson, a seasoned wildlife photographer, stood frozen in disbelief. A tiny lion cub, no more than 4 months old, had slipped into the water, yanked away by the merciless current. In that split second, years of professional training and strict rules about non-interference vanished. All that remained was a human heart unwilling to watch a baby die. David had been documenting wildlife in the Masai Mara for nearly a decade. He had seen the raw power of nature, the beauty, the cruelty, and the balance. He had learned the unspoken law of the wild: observe, but never interfere. Nature must take its course. But as the cub's terrified squeals echoed above the roar of the river, something inside David shattered. The helpless flailing of that small creature tugged at something far deeper than his professional code. It touched his soul. Without a second thought, he dropped his camera, kicked off his boots, and dove into the swollen river. The water was freezing and thick with silt, making it nearly impossible to see or breathe. The current slammed into him with the force of a truck, pushing him downstream, battering him against hidden rocks and submerged branches. But none of that mattered. Somewhere ahead, a life was slipping away. Fighting every second to stay afloat, David caught sight of the cub just ahead, barely conscious, its tiny body bobbing like a leaf. With every ounce of strength, David lunged forward and wrapped his arms around the shivering ball of fur. The cub, panicked and gasping, instinctively clung to David's shoulders, burying its small claws into his soaked jacket. David could feel the frantic beating of the cub's heart against his chest. It was a fragile heartbeat, but it was still there. And that was all that mattered. The journey back to shore was even more brutal. A submerged log slammed into David's left shoulder, nearly knocking him unconscious. Pain shot through his body, but he gritted his teeth and kept going. Each step was a battle, the muddy river pulling him down like a living thing, eager to claim both man and cub. He knew that crocodiles often lurked in these waters. He knew he might not make it out alive. But he also knew he couldn't let go. Not now. Not when the cub had held on to him like a lifeline. When David finally reached shallower ground, gasping and trembling, he clung to the thought that he had done the right thing. He had saved a life, not for fame, not for science, but because he simply couldn't stand by and do nothing. At that moment, David Thompson was not a photographer. He was not a scientist or an observer of the wild. He was just a man who answered the silent plea of a helpless creature. He didn't yet know what was waiting for him on the riverbank. He didn't know that his actions had been witnessed by the cub's entire pride. He had no idea that his brave rescue would not only save a life, but forge a bond between man and beast that would shake the foundations of science itself. All he knew was that he had chosen compassion over caution, heart over habit, and that choice would change everything. As David lay on the riverbank, soaked, bruised, and gasping for air, the rescued lion cub whimpered softly in his arms. Every instinct told him to get up and retreat, fast. The rest of the pride had appeared, emerging silently from the tall grass like ghosts. Their golden eyes locked onto him, unblinking, unreadable. He counted at least 6 adult lions. 2 enormous males, 3 lionesses, and another young cub trailing cautiously behind. They were close, too close. One wrong move, and he wouldn't stand a chance. David had always respected lions from a distance. He admired their strength, their dignity, but he never forgot their power. And yet here he was, lying defenseless, holding one of their own. He expected growls, a warning, perhaps even an attack. But none came. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The lead lioness, the cub's mother, he assumed, approached slowly. Her gaze never left David's face. Her body moved with the tense grace of a predator, yet her eyes held something unfamiliar, curiosity, and something deeper. She didn't roar. She didn't bare her teeth. She simply stood over him, towering and silent, before gently nosing the cub still clinging to David's chest. David barely breathed. Then, in a moment he would never forget, the lioness licked the cub's head and, astonishingly, nuzzled David's arm. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even caution. It was gratitude. One by one, the other lions moved closer. Not in aggression, but in what felt like a strange ceremony of acceptance. One male circled David, brushing against him like a cat marking its own. The second lioness lay down just a few feet away, eyes half closed, as if signaling peace. The rescued cub squeaked and stumbled back to its family, but kept glancing over its shoulder, toward David. And then the most surreal moment arrived. The same lioness who had nuzzled him lay beside David, her flank touching his soaked arm. She blinked slowly, the same way house cats do when they trust you. David, overwhelmed, felt his fear drain away, replaced by a quiet awe. He wasn't being tolerated. He was being accepted. In all his years photographing wildlife, David had never seen behavior like this. Lions were fiercely territorial, protective, wild. But in that moment, they saw not a threat, not an intruder, but a savior. Somehow, in the wild language of instinct and emotion, they understood what he had done, and they trusted him. For the next hour, David remained among the pride. They surrounded him, not like guards, but like kin. One of the younger lionesses even brought over a piece of leftover antelope, placing it beside him, a gesture that, in the lion world, was nothing short of sacred. By the time the sun began to set, David rose slowly, his body aching, his soul forever changed. The lions watched him leave, but made no move to stop him. In fact, the cub, now dry and playful again, trotted after him for a few steps before its mother called it back with a gentle growl. David walked back to his camp in silence, the roars of the pride echoing behind him, not as a warning, but as a farewell. In that single, unimaginable encounter, a wall had crumbled between man and beast. It wasn't magic. It wasn't fantasy. It was trust, earned not by dominance, but by compassion. He had entered their world to save a life. In return, they had shown him something science could never explain, a bond forged not by language, but by the purest form of understanding. David would never be the same. The golden hues of the African sunset stretched across the sky, casting long, warm shadows over the savannah. David stood still, drenched, scraped, and overwhelmed by everything that had just unfolded. Around him, the lion pride, majestic and fearsome yet strangely gentle, gathered in a half-circle. He was not one of them, and yet, he was. The rescued cub, now dry and playful, padded up to him once more, its tiny paws stirring dust in the fading light. It looked up at David with those wide, golden eyes full of innocence and recognition. Then, in a moment that shattered every wall around David's heart, the cub pressed its head softly against his knee. Not out of fear or confusion, but gratitude. David knelt, unable to stop the emotion rising in his chest. He stroked the cub's soft fur, feeling its warmth, its heartbeat, its life, a life he had pulled from the edge of death. This small, living being had no words, but its message was clear. The cub's mother approached again, her large form commanding yet calm. She paused just inches away from David, eyes locked with his. Then she leaned in and gently touched her forehead to his. It wasn't just a gesture, it was a gift. In the language of lions, it was a powerful act of acceptance, perhaps even love. David closed his eyes, overcome by the magnitude of the moment. He had studied these animals for years. But nothing had prepared him for this level of trust, this profound connection. One by one, the other lions joined in what could only be described as a quiet ceremony. One of the lionesses brushed past his side, her tail briefly curling around his leg. Another lay down in front of him and let out a low, almost purring sound, soft, calming, welcoming. Even the two dominant males, regal and immense, took a few steps forward and bowed their massive heads ever so slightly. It was not submission. It was respect. David stood slowly, unsure what would happen next. But to his amazement, the pride began to move, not away, but with him. They flanked his sides as he began walking back toward the distant ridge where his camp lay. No growls. No suspicion. Just silent, regal guardianship. It was as if they were escorting a king back to his castle. Each step felt surreal. A human being, walking side by side with a pride of lions. No cages, no fences, no fear. Only something unspoken, ancient, and deeply sacred. A bond born not of dominance, but compassion. Not through training, but through shared experience. When they reached the edge of the tall grass, just before the trees began, the pride halted. David turned to look at them, his throat tight with emotion. The cub took a few brave steps toward him again, then sat and let out a soft, almost melodic cry, parting words in its own language. David smiled through tears, whispering, "Goodbye, little one. Stay strong." As if understanding, the cub bounded back to its family. Then came the final farewell. The lead lioness let out a deep, resonant call, half roar, half song, that echoed across the plains. The others joined in, their voices rising in perfect harmony. But it wasn't a warning. It wasn't a hunt. It was a tribute, a chorus of gratitude. And David knew they were singing for him. Tears streamed down his cheeks. He had come